Thank you, Gada. That was wonderful. And our last speaker of this part of the program is Matthew Ritchie. Matthew has been involved with the exhibition on several different levels. As you know, he has a painting and wall treatment as well as video, and he has contributed to the catalog. So I have no idea what Matthew's actually going to talk about. You ready?
So, thanks, Mark. Mark kindly invited me to do all of those things, so it's all his fault. And I'm going to talk about all three of them in a kind of weird way that I write in the catalog that an artist is a bit like a talking dog. When they write, it's kind of not really how well they do it, it's that they do it at all. So, for better or for worse, I'm going to sort of talk you through some of the ideas in the essay and the installation, which had the same title, and really this is the kind of third work I made for the show. And it starts with thinking, when Mark started talking about the show, I emailed him back saying, I, like everyone on the planet, is thinking about where we are now. It's not good news. We have eliminated 50% of the species on Earth, and we're on our way to 70, 80%. And we're all, although it's easy to think about this moment as a moment of great division, we as a species are unified in this single goal. And we are also understanding that we know almost nothing about the physical structure of the universe. After thousands of years of concerted effort, we've come up with a kind of sense that, my God, we know almost even less than when we began. So I think this sense of chaos and awe, or of a kind of anxiety, is like a kind of pretty legit, response to that situation. Like we're in a moment that is actually unprecedented in human history in our influence on the world. So this is where we're getting for the first time a different kind of evidence about that. We're receiving it through a level of machinic manipulation and technological structure that really changes this idea that maybe we're just making it up, maybe there are alternative facts, maybe it's just an opinion. We can see through radio telescopes that we don't know what the universe is. We have theories based on real physical observations that the universe is like physically structured in ways that are incomprehensible to human thought, and indeed maybe antithetical to any kinds of the thoughts about logic or intelligence or rationalization that have dominated human thinking and scientific thinking for the last 2,000 years. These are just some of the models of the universe that are talked about quite freely as real possibilities by various physicists: multiverses, quantum foam, holographic universes. And at the same time, we have become nature. We've inverted the postmodern sort of dictum that history is how we turn nature into myth. We are actually becoming nature. We've aerosolized the environment to the extent that the air itself and the ozone layer and pollution are actually affecting the way plants grow, nutrition in our food. Everything is changing. And we've surpassed, these are the 9 planetary boundaries that we are now surpassing. Once we get through all 9 of them, and I'm sure we will, the consequences, according to chaos theorists and physicists and geologists and ecologists and anyone with half a brain, are completely unpredictable. We enter a nonlinear phase of human development. In other words, things like where I was up this summer in the Gulf of Maine, the ocean warmed 11 degrees, the Gulf of Maine, in one summer, which is theoretically something everyone would say that's not really possible. It's happening. So biodiversity, access, these are the biodiversity hotspots, global warming, we've all seen this hot summer. And then there's the kind of more prosaic, the stories we tell, that we turn into we want a picture of it. But we're getting the pictures. We're sort of like, well, where's the evidence? We see the evidence every day. We see it every year, we see it every month. This is where I lived. This is my neighborhood after Sandy. It's literally coming right to everyone's doorstep. So my work for a long time has dealt with this sense of unease. I was just talking to someone the other day. He said when he saw this show in 2004, I think it was, he sort of thought, are you okay about the artist? Is the artist okay here? And I guess my answer was like, I didn't really have it together at the time, was like, I'm kind of not interested in us being okay. I don't think we should be okay. We're not okay. So I'm probably not okay either. The whole situation isn't okay. And so when we talk about chaos and awe, I think one of the fantastic and provocative things about the question is, about the exhibition, is like, how do we represent that moment? Because if we cannot represent it, if we cannot picture it, as humans, we are kind of trapped in a moment of this like, well, I prefer to feel okay, but at least if you're going to try and talk to me about something, I need a picture, I need a story, I need some way to understand something that otherwise seems overwhelming, or I will capitulate to a vague, ambiguous sense of dread and just go home and drink myself to death. So my work has often also talked about this, and another way to respond to this is through, this is one of my frequent collaborators, is through collaboration with other people, especially musicians and architects and the kinds of people who are going forward into the world to make large bodies of work that engage multiple groups of people at the same time without sort of distinctions that the art world often places around itself. If you think about a concert is kind of borderless. If you think about a building, or something maybe more like this, a building system that can be entered or left through any number of entry points or exit points, you start to be able to get the idea that it's not impossible to respond to the situation, but it is going to require a really fundamental shift in how we think about edges. But in my essay, I talk about how the overwhelming sense of chaos is a very early thing. I'm not going to make everyone, I'm just sort of including these here to sort of like, I'm going to walk through the essay, and these are kind of fragments from the paragraphs, which I'm sure you've all read and memorized. But at the very beginning of what we think of as civilization, Hesiod, the Greek author, talks about reality in terms of four forces. And the universe, a lot of the early universes kind of look like this. There's this kind of bubble in which everyone lives. And it's got, you can sort of see over here, there's always a bad place. And there's a kind of good place. And then there's a kind of place in between where all the stuff happens. And in this stuff, this is where all the good kind of sexy stuff happens. This is where, we have. And this kind of duality, is echoed throughout the centuries. This is William Blake's, who, if I have a spiritual sort of forebear, it's probably Blake, who's, there's the kind of, the good place is often this old, beardy, sort of fussy guy who's like got a big protractor and is like organizing everything. And the bad place is this kind of very sort of feminine, groovy, kind of orgiastic, chaotic environment. And there's this kind of odd duality, so built in right into the whole cultural narrative is a fear of chaos, a fear of porosity, a fear of boundaryless states. And I don't think it's a surprise that if you look at Blake's kind of funny thing here, this is the famous Lorentz strange attractor, the Lorentz Butterfly. This is the symbol of chaos itself. This is the math. And Blake was making that drawing. We've always sort of the oceanic state as this state of chaos. But this is a piece of math just like the protractor is a piece of math. There's no actual distinction between these two states mathematically. One is just more complex than the other. So the question that comes to mind is have we always just been afraid of complexity itself? So in my essay, I talk about the early thing, that the universe that Hesiod sort of articulates as these four poles. There's chaos, which is understood to be sort of before the universe. Then there's nature and eros, or kind of like matter and procreation. And then it generates this kind of negative space, the bad space, the space of theory, this kind of shadow zone. And so in a series, I've been working on this for a couple of years. There's 25 of these diagrams. I'm only going to talk about 3 today. Don't worry, don't panic. That will take me all the time that we have just talking about them. The production of these spaces is the external abyss, nature, desire, and the internal abyss. This is the sort of whole. And we fill the whole up with what Kant, I'll talk about in a minute, mathematical sublime, with fantasies of order. And in the middle of all that is us. This is what the Greeks called a daimon, or a demon, which is a kind of semi-legitimized, semi-human, but semi-divine figure who's like kind of hovering between states, like all of us, of sort of enlightenment and confusion and despair and empowerment. And this is where the Greeks had sort of, or the Hellenistic society, understood this as a kind of the essential problem. And they hypothesized that each of us was just sort of born with a certain kind of set of influences around us. And we feel, I think, that sense of uncanniness within us all the time. But that's only been exaggerated by the discoveries I was talking about before, which over the last century have given us all of this data about a situation that none of us can really grasp. In fact, they're non-human, these concerns, in the way that ancient divinities were understood to be non-human. It wasn't an old guy with a beard. It was an enormous, complex sort of mythology of crazy natural forces all interacting to produce the world we live in today. And but at the same time, we're getting all this other kind of data. This is the famous connectome. This is a map of your brain. Your brain can think about 1,700 things at the same time, which is amazing. But it has to include all these things like gravity and light and your stomach and your shoes and your shirt and the heat and everything. So what's kind of left is like a little bit of the brain for listening to me talk. Because you really can't, there's a lot going on. And so we all have a tremendous difficulty, and I'm saying all this in a way to start to talk about the idea of painting, what painters do alone in the studio, is that this idea of, sort of how we focus and what we focus on is a very complex and difficult subject. And the language is emerging around this complexity out of the computational environments we've emerged. And the word that's sort of thrown around is, so this is what's coming into your brain, and this is what your brain tries to do with it. It tries to put it together in a little picture all the time. It tries to listen, but it's distracted by the lights, and it tries to look at the lights, but it's distracted by the sounds. We heard earlier the word synesthesia. That's an inherent condition because light and sound are both electromagnetic radiation. They're really kind of the same thing, and your brain has to figure that out all the time. And then it has to go through this 4-part process where it sees objects, it processes them through all these bits and pieces, and then finally it gets to what is called ownership and agency, which is where you begin to feel, once again, like the person that you're supposed to be. So this all got kind of like in the time of David, where they're painting like proper pictures, that some people might think of. All these terms got kind of like organized in a nice thing that would be called the schema. So you've got the unknown or the chaotic, the awe and full of awe. And then you had these other correlative terms. You've got ideal and ugly. You've got natural and surreal, sort of the real and the unreal. You've got the disfigured and the self and the figurative. And in the middle was something called the picturesque. And that's like a proper painting. I think very few of the paintings in Mark's show are what would be called proper paintings in that sense, right? Imagine taking them back like to 1780, 1790, and people would just be like, what on earth are you showing me here? Because they were trying to fit everything into what Kant called the schema, which is this funny little architecture. He talks about it like a little building. It's like if you have a properly ordered mind, it's like a well-built house. The thoughts are balanced on other thoughts, and they all lock together to produce an enlightened sort of sense of the world. And the picturesque is at the center of this. It's how we see the world. And I think we're all kind of struggling as well with an educational legacy where we're kind of, on the one hand, when you go through school, very much encouraged to imagine that the world should naturally turn into a picture where everything's organized. That's its proper state of being. And the connection to the mathematical sublime is a connection to a deeper metonymical sense of order that implies that nature itself is an ordered space, not a chaotic space. So the counter question is like, if you want to have a contemporary picture of knowledge, like a contemporary theory of picture, what's the contemporary theory of knowledge that backs it up? It's obviously not the picturesque. So this was where I sort of began my essay, was with these kind of questions of like, we've got the 4 poles again, they're always in the same place. There's the universe, or sort of chaos, and theory, which is the sort of Tartarus, kind of hell. There's humans, and there's nature. And in the middle, you need kind of all 4 to be going. It's like an engine. If it's missing one of them, if you have no theory, you've just got these 3 things, humans, chaos, and nature. That's not going to work. If you've got no universe, you're missing out on all the good stuff. You've got no nature, you're missing. So, you see what I mean? Like this is what we call the ontological minima. And each of the ontological minima has, to our delight, an equal kind of time attached to it. So the universe and theory have quantum space-time. Humans in theory have a very strange relationship in that we have this expectation that theory will tell us what will happen in the future. And theory doesn't work like that. Theory is a reflection of what has happened in the past. But we're always stuck on this kind of idea that with a good enough theory, we'll be able to figure out what we're doing next week, next year, good enough schedule, I'm going to be on vacation, I'm going to meet my parents. So it works for a little while, like a week. I was at a conference in Santa Fe, at the Santa Fe Institute, on the limits of predictive thinking, and they said, they've been working on predictive theory now for 100 years, a little more. We have not advanced we have a 10-day window in which you can have an accurate predictive theory of the weather. In all that time, there has been no improvement whatsoever. The fundamental conditions of nature are that it is too large and too complex to predict accurately. Nonetheless, this axis is the one we hope most about. This is where our hopes are. This one, experience time, the nature between humans and nature, is the one we like the least. That's the Murphy's Law axis. And then this one, chronological time, deep time, which is what some of the people talking before me had started to talk about, is kind of the one we're the most afraid of. Because in deep time, we start to see the true arbitrariness and strangeness of nature and how bigger patterns repeat themselves. So making a picture is kind of complicated because it needs to do all of these things for us at the same time. When you're an artist, you've got to you're kind of guessing and you're simulating, and you're predicting and you're imagining and anticipating and observing all at once. And as we've all noticed recently, but really, let's face it, for all human history, when we don't share a picture of how the world is, we like to leave things out. Things get left out. When we don't have a neurotypical consensus, our theories of picture become fragmented, and one picture doesn't match with the other. And when we're getting information that is too complex for any theory of picture to fit into, we simply can't adapt. We have a maladaptation. We're simply not able to grasp that these theories of picture are in direct conflict with each other. And we keep trying to explain it away. So one of the ways and so we end up with something like this. We have the attention complex, which is where we are now. Your phones, you've got your internally modified, 70% of Americans are on some kind of medication. You're externally modified. Everyone's on their phone all the time. And then your physical environment is modified by the petrochemical complex. In other words, the air, the food, everything you're breathing. So your body is constantly being changed at every single level by your physical environment without your active consent. It's just happening. So your attention is naturally fragmented and sort of dissolved across these kind of different modes of physical being. And human biochemistry, is really reflected in human politics. So we get this kind of natural, we're literally, tearing ourselves apart. This is, by the way, a totally natural condition. And the fact that these things are in a total asymmetry is also a natural condition. This is the famous diagram of the four forces. This is how the universe is really made up of these fundamental units of measure, each one of which is wildly different to the others and in a state of constant tension with the other forces. Gravity, light, the weak force and the strong force are literally ripping themselves apart, even in this room, and very, very slowly. We're just all slowly seeping away and pulling back together and being dragged down to the ground and bombarded with radiation. It's all going on right here. It's like a war of all against all. It looks nice in this little diagram, but it's right in this room, chaos and awe is happening. And this is, so there are various kinds of diagrams that show exactly how this works. This is Graham Harman's famous quadruple object. There's the universe, which is what he calls real things, real qualities, and central qualities. So once again, once all these kinds of pictures start to stack up, though, it's very, very hard, given the complexity of your brain and that you've only got a few hundred neurons really left over to deal with it, to keep them in any kind of coherent space. So the question that I think this exhibition asks, and that I'm particularly interested in answering in a way, is whether we can come up with a better model, a better way of thinking about it, that does include all of this stuff. There's the pictures, there's the different kinds of time, there's the math. And of course, the answer is you can always make a diagram of everything. That's the beauty of diagram. They're stepped-down neurological consensus patterns that have been worked on for 8,000, 10,000 years. They really precede what we know of as the idea of human consciousness. So they're a kind of the minimal language in which we are able to communicate this, maybe a sense of connectivity with these ideas. And just to take this one step further, of course, diagrams are nice because they're flat. But reality is not flat. Reality is a three-dimensional surface moving in time with possibly 4 to 10 other dimensions. But we can sort of represent reality as an energy surface, like this kind of wavy surface. Like this room is filled with wavy surfaces, bouncing things around, bouncing sound, thoughts, everything's moving around. This gets more interesting when you add the ontological minima. There's like the different types of time, different types of experience that we're having. So while we're experiencing all these things evolving in time, it's happening in this energy landscape. Some people have had a lot of coffee and sugar like me, which is why I'm able to talk so fast. Others may not have had quite enough, which is why their eyelids are slowly drooping. But if you think of this as a surface, you begin to be able to think about we can understand why paintings can become the kind of picture. You can think of this as a picture surface that embodies an energy environment where over time the painter has shown up and poured in all of these thoughts and ideas and laminated them onto an actual energy surface that is in some very odd way an actual parallel to the experience of space and time being placed into a small square and colored in. There's a technical term for this. It's called disordered hyperuniformity. So there's like a mountain range, that's a quantum event, and that is the only place that disordered hyperuniformity is actually found in nature is the retina of a chicken. It's a chicken's eye retina. So it doesn't see pictures, it just sees that, which explains a lot about chickens. And all of those jokes about them crossing the road, it's like, the chicken's like, what road? That's what I see. Like, what are you looking at? We're like, can't you see the mountain? So I think of myself, there's a lot of jokes about sort of monkeys painting, but it's kind of more like this is the kind of world we get into when you're a painter, because you're like right up close and you're like, yes, it all matters. It all matters. But I think there's a nice analogy in that to the idea that painting is maybe something more like radar, and that when you talk about radar working, it paints an object. And I don't know if any one of you have been in a kind of piece of equipment that needs radar, but when you see the radar image of, say, weather or a boat or something, it's just a scatter of dots. It's not, you're kind of like, is that a thing? Should we be worried about that thing? If you're flying or something, and it's just like black and white dots. It's like, I don't know, is it a cloud? Is it a plane? What the hell is it? And you have to sort of think about, and it's moving. The dots are flickering in and out of being. So you start to think much more about painting as a kind of idea of time, the presence of a opticality in time, rather than a frozen image, rather than the Kantian picture, or like the David's picture of this idea of a hierarchical space in which all honor, patriarchy, matriarchy, everything is fixed and rigid. Painting itself becomes an analogy for a more flexible open space. In this, it's similar to other images of chaos. This is called the Lakes of Wada, which is a mathematical sort of puzzle, which is basically you take a little bubble and you add another bubble and you add another bubble and you add another bubble. And it starts to produce this space of topological looping. What's important to me about this is one of the key features of painting is that it is a suspended phase space. It's like a trampoline. And it's over all these ideas. But in this trampoline, I'm not proposing, nor does painting really propose, a mixing in the sense that everything is dissolved into one homogeneous ruling form. Physically, painting is the suspension of elements inside. This is a painted surface. So you can see, and I think this is a critical point about the value of painting, is it's not about the dissolution of identities, but nor is it about the sort of assumption that identities are separated. It is about the construction of a shared surface. And this is a kind of complicated idea because it turns inside out a lot of our notions of what constitutes edges and inside and outside. A painting clearly has an edge, but within that edge, it proposes these kinds of multiple forms of coexistence. But nonetheless are discrete entities, but they're all kind of working in concert to produce a collective form. And so going back to the beginning, and in my essay I talk about this rather extensively because I love this idea of entelechy, which is that there's no kind of beginning or end to this process of painting. Painting is what's called a deverbal noun, which is that it's sort of, I'm painting while I'm painting and I'm looking at a painting, and you can come look at my painting while I'm painting. It's like no kind of end to the looping. It's like I'm doing it and I'm looking at it. And there's a few other really nice, like drawing and building and meeting, and they all share this similar quality of like, this is something we're all kind of doing together. And it's a thing that's much more about doing than it is about a kind of finite state of picturableness. And so And where we're doing it is on this surface of exchange. We need this, what becomes the equivalent of a kind of a game space, where there's this thing that's to be painted, the idea of painting, and the painter, and the process, which relate to the four poles of the ontological minima, are all happening at the same time. No one is privileged, no one is refused, no one form, because they're all understood to be a continuous process. So, and the way this kind of starts to break down specifically in terms that I find interesting are it also starts to explain some of the rather mysterious processes that go on in the studio, in that you can have a diagram, sort of what you're going to do, then you can have a kind of sketch, which is where you kind of mess up the diagram a bit and it gets all kind of blurry and confusing. And then you can start to have the painting, where you're sort of like beginning to turn it back into something that becomes recognizable. And a feature of this exhibition is that the sense of chaos and awe are contingent on each other, and the way that you start to get rid of them is by really starting to define or exclude possibilities. So the more exclusionary painting becomes, the less accurate it is to its own intelligence. And this is sort of the 2,000-year arc of painting, that Kantian moment where the picture becomes privileged as a frozen moment of hierarchical thinking, is also a moment we can clearly identify with some of the worst excesses of human behavior. Not the only moment, but one of them. The one moment where they became codified into the legal structures of the time. So that it's I think both a political and for me, a very emotional thing to sort of talk about the openness of painting in this show. So my answer to this in the show was to talk about this idea of this illimitable ocean. But what's critical to that is understanding that you can't just throw people into the ocean and expect them to swim, right? That is how your kids drown. Like that's not the right answer. It's just saying, hey, everybody, it's a big universe. That sucks. You have to explain the rules of any given situation. You have to know how to swim. You have to know how to move through the ocean. Otherwise, it is simply just this illimitable, chaotic space. That's also what artists do. So in the painting in the show, A Bridge, a Gate, an Ocean, I'm talking about painting as a bridge, as a gate, and an ocean. It does all three things at the same time. It offers you a way forward in a structured, very kind of big, diagrammatic way. It's a gate. You can step through it or not, but it's to a kind of different kind of space. And beyond that space, in the background, is this oceanic sort of, what looks like maybe a bit of a blur, but in the context of this sort of the entire installation, you can sort of start to see, here's this kind of the diagram of these small shapes. This is the history of the diagram. Then there's the drawing. Then there's the painting on top of that, this three-part articulation, moving from the simplest form to the sort of what I think of as the process of discovery, to the process of complete abandonment, but also kind of a fulfillment. There it is in the actual exhibition. It's amazing how that was the thing I sent to Mark. Pretty good, right? But the key to that is also sort of counterbalancing that, like the danger with paintings of chaos. And I feel like this is a conversation I would love to pick up with the panel afterwards, is that by only accepting this kind of notion of a kind of ambiguity, that in itself becomes a form of privilege. It's like we know how to swim. Not everyone does, and so there's a kind of obligation of not only this entelechy and presenting the entelechy of painting, but also of presenting the discourse that allows people to get to it. In other words, telling the story. So this final part of the show that I put in was another installation in the film room, which is to do with this idea of eversion. This is the diagram in the essay of eversion, and that's diagram 24.1 in the diagram sequence. And this is an idea of how do we turn ourselves inside out? Not only to make sure that we're asking all the right questions, but to make sure that we're including all the possible ways in which we can be human, and to some extent be not human, and to acknowledge the ways in which we are not human, in the ways in which this room is filled with radiation. And also, if each one of you has, I think, 3 trillion bacteria living in your gut alone, not to mention all the other creatures and critters living on your bodies, we're in the middle right now in this room of a kind of civilization of competing species. It's all going on. This is as much nature as what's outside this wall. And we have to kind of accept that to come to terms with what we're doing to and with nature. So this process called eversion, it's a fancy math term. It means you can turn things inside out Critical to the term, though, is that you're not allowed to tear them or cut them in any way. You have to mathematically map every point and maintain every single point. You can't throw anything away. You can't keep anything outside. You can't build a wall around it. You've just got to turn it inside out, keeping everything. It looks something like this when mathematicians draw it. So this line is gradually being sort of evoluted. But so how do you do that with people? So my answer in this show, so this is a kind of collaborator of mine, Shara Warden, who's really a kind of fantastic person. And I sort of think of musicians as kind of like demons, in that when they step on stage, they become kind of semi-divine. You know, they acquire, suddenly they can sing, fill a stadium. They can convince you of their sorrows and their joys. But even someone as great as Shara is not actually turning herself inside out. But I thought maybe for this particular project, we could sort of make that happen. So at sunset on the beach, on the West Coast, on the eve of Halloween, it is all very important that these things happen at exactly this one moment. We staged a performance, and this was sort of, so first you take this semi-divine person, then you kind of equip them to really represent the sunset. And Turner, going back to Media's talk about Turner his dying words were, "The sun is God." He understood that nature was larger than people. This was kind of what the representation of the fragmented self. So we took the film of that event and then processed it, and I think you can see it sort of most clearly. This is a kind of person turning into the sun, and the sun turning back into the person. And this one here, she sort of becomes, and this was heavily processed through the kind of computational architecture, and then there's a song, and in the song she sings a bridge, a gate, an ocean, over and over again, which is a quote from Paradise Lost, heavily sort of redacted, about the bridge to chaos. So this is this kind of idea of we can maybe represent not just the ocean, but us diving into it. And I think that's what I would hope the most, is that when we all start to talk about this together, is to realize that we are in this together, and we'll know we're in it together when we feel this turning inside out. This is that diagram sort of turning into a painting. And notice that this figure is emerging, and that the new figure, it's easy to sort of subcategorize them and then say they're this, they're that, there they are. They live in Pittsburgh, they live in Mexico City, they live in Singapore. If we move these pieces around enough, either we'll be happy or we'll be unhappy. I think the conversation is deeper than that. It's understanding there's really only one figure. I'm an illegal immigrant when I first got here, but you don't get to call yourself an illegal immigrant when you come from England. You're an expatriate, because it sounds much more, no one's just like, you're in the States, you're an expat. But that didn't mean I didn't spend time in that little room with those grim-faced guys with the badges. So it's like I resist this idea of restrictive categorizations that we should look at everyone coming into this country, everyone who came here from somewhere else. But so did everyone in the world came from somewhere else. This kind of idea of a retreat to an originary self. But at the same time, I resist the idea that we shouldn't acknowledge the individuality of all those component parts. So reconciling the specific identities and the way all those pigments were suspended in the phase space of painting, that's the process where we start to see what are the commonalities in these series of picture, what is emerging. It's a difficult process, it's a complex process, which I hope is really the theme of my essay and my work, is that this is not something to be casually sort of thrown around. It's not like globalization. This is a process like any scientific process that requires multiple levels of iteration. And if you don't understand them, you're just going to break them. But I think of this person, I hope for this person, the kind of everted future where we turn ourselves inside out and there are no more boundaries. And we're all stepping into the world of painting together. It'll feel a little like drowning at the start because we don't really know how to swim in this yet. And that's maybe part of that fear of chaos and awe. But it'll also feel a little bit like flying as you realize the whole ocean just kind of lifts you up. Thank you.